Hi, everybody. That was sort of a swift cut off to the music. Apologies for that. Welcome. I'm so glad that everybody is here. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm Rabbi Jonah Weiner. I'm the Director of Learning here at Trua. We're an organization, Trua, that brings together more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors from all streams of Judaism, together with all members of the Jewish community, to act on the Jewish imperative to respect and advance human rights of all people. And in that vein, I'm really excited to spend an hour with all of you talking about anti-Semitism. I want to do some important sort of like table setting caveats before we really get into the work. But first, I just want to express my real gratitude that so many of you showed up to talk about this really important issue all together and do some learning. The first thing I want to say is just some sort of Zoom logistic pieces. Um, Both because this is like such a raw and sort of high intensity topic in a lot of ways, we've chosen to disable the public chat. All the things that we feel are really important, and I really do want to hear all of your feedback and all of your thoughts. At the same time, there's just too many people to be able to moderate this in a way that's effective and make sure everybody's safe and all of those things. But what I want to ask you to do, first of all, is that if you have any tech challenges that are on your end, if you can't hear somebody, if you can't hear me, if there's something that's not working for you, my colleague Bella Orden is here. She's waving. She has tech help in her name in the Zoom. Feel free to ask her any questions you have related to technology. If you have questions about the content, we're going to do Q&A right at the end of the presentation. But if things come up as we go, I'm not going to be able to see it while I'm chatting. But feel free to message me throughout, and I'll look at that at the end. So any content questions to me, any technology related questions to Bella, who's amazing and going to do this wonderful, wonderful job of helping each and every one of you. I'll also say that there's enough folks here that I suspect we won't get to every question. So this is my pre-apology in advance that if I don't get to hear your question, I would love to chat with you later. My email is public. I'll put it at the end also. It's in the last slide, but I would love to continue the conversation about this stuff. It's all deeply important. The other thing I want to say, Zoom announces it, but just to make sure everyone is aware, this webinar is being recorded. We're going to share the webinar after the event with everybody who registered, but just so that you're aware. Also, there's closed captioning available, so you can select that option in Zoom if you want or need it, or if that's useful in any way. We're also going to be sharing out the slides from this. So if that's, if you're a person who takes notes to like gain information, that's great. You should feel free to do that. But you shouldn't feel the need to stress about that in any real way. Okay. With all that said, I'm excited to get going together. Let's do it. I want to just give two sort of important introductory notes. The first one is that we're really grateful to all of our friends and partners in the city of New York. They've done a million wonderful things to make this possible for us. But I want to say that this presentation specifically reflects, my views and analysis, the views and analysis of Trua, and not the city of New York, the New York City Human Rights Commission, or the Office for the Prevention of Hate Crimes, although we're very grateful for them funding this work. I also want to say that for educational purposes, there's anti-Semitic imagery in this. Nothing, horrific and graphic, but there is anti-Semitic imagery and white supremacist propaganda in this presentation. If those things are disturbing to you, which wouldn't it be beautiful to live in a world where everyone was disturbed by such things? Feel free to do the things that you need to do to ground yourself in that way, right? Whether it's take a moment to step away, take a breath, you know yourself, but you should feel comfortable to do that and know that like these things are disturbing and it's okay to be disturbed by them. Okay. All of that said, I want to talk about why this matters right now, right? Why are we doing a big conversation about anti-Semitism in this moment? I want to start with something from a piece of work that has been really influential on my thinking about this. It's like a little bit older, but it feels evergreen to read it now in many ways. This is the past didn't go anywhere. It sort of came out of the Occupy movement in a lot of ways. And it's sort of like a movement guide for thinking through anti-Semitism. And April Rosenblum writes in that guide this line: "The past didn't go anywhere. Anti-Semitism didn't somehow naturally disappear after its worst outbreak. Our whole activist lives are based on the understanding that oppression doesn't go away by itself. You have to take action. Whole people's movements have to, collectively, for a real shift to occur." I think this emphasizes sort of 2 points that I want to make as we sort of start to dive into the work together. The first is that none of these things have gone away by themselves, right? No hatred, none of these pieces will just sort of fade with time, right? These wounds don't heal automatically. At the same time, like there are actual things we can really do to make things different, right? Anti-Semitism is a product of social conditions, and therefore we can work on those social conditions together as a team. And why does this matter in this specific moment, right? As I've highlighted with this image here, right? We're in a moment of real rising extremism, right? Jews are being targeted and blamed, or wedge is being created between Jewish people and other groups. And understanding Jewish people and how anti-Semitism works is a real crucial step for building and deepening the kind of relationships we need to make a better world. Um, and in addition, right, we need these things to be able to assess the real threats that Jewish people face and how to fight them together. So I'm hoping that we can do this, fight anti-Semitism, understand what it is, and help us fight white supremacy. It's important for me to lay out some like objectives of what are we going to do together in our time over the next little bit so that we can like sort of ground conceptually what kind of work we're trying to do. So first, we're going to go through some definitions in history, right? Some analysis of like what is anti-Semitism structurally? Where does it come from? How does it work? We're going to try and do some distinguishing between discomfort and anti-Semitism. Right? Discomfort is also important. It matters a lot. But also understanding that just because something someone said might make us, uncomfortable or something we dislike, right, that doesn't necessarily make that anti-Semitism. I think that's where a lot of the murkiness is. So hopefully we're going to get into all that murk together. And then lastly, I want to sort of create some space for us to find permission to be emotional and confused about it. This is a really intense topic. It's a really difficult one. And I'll say one of my most important takeaways from this whole thing is that there are not clear-cut answers to a lot of these questions. There are a few things that there are really bright lines around, but for a lot of this is just complicated, and I don't think we're going to be able to get through any of these things without coming in with like good faith, willingness to listen to one another, and willingness to really understand. So hopefully I'll just share that sense with each and every one of you. Okay, so this is the order in which we're going to tackle things, if that's a useful framework for you. First, we're going to start with some definitions just to like ground our understanding so it's clear what I'm talking about while I'm talking. Then we're going to go through some of the tropes and history of anti-Semitism, some of the like core narrative bedrocks of it. Then we're going to talk about how those tropes in history impact us and our lives in the United States today, right? And by today, I also mean for the last like 100 years. Then we're going to talk about the highly uncontroversial topic of Israel, anti-Semitism, free speech, that whole nexus. And then we're going to sort of like end out with some recommendations for how to approach those conversations in ways that feel really productive. Okay, let's get into the definitions. So first, to talk about Jews and to talk about anti-Semitism is to have a conversation about the Jewish people, like who we are. I'll say I was blessed to be a campus rabbi for several years, and one of the things I taught as a campus rabbi was an intro to Judaism class for a couple of years. And I'll say even among groups primarily made up of Jewish people, when I asked people to either describe a Jewish person or to draw a Jewish person, the image that most people had in their minds was of a Hasidic man, which is great. Hasidic men are Jewish people. That's one of the images of who we are. And also that's not all of who we are, right? There's a huge diversity internal to the Jewish people. So I want to say before I get into any conversation about anti-Semitism, like who are we as human beings, right? There's humongous diversity of who the Jewish people are and how we express our Judaism, right? Even as you can just see from some of these photos, right? We're not a monolith, right? We're not one age, we're not one socioeconomic bracket, we're not one race, we're not one ethnicity, right? All of these things, it's all like quite a bit more complicated than that. And I think a lot of the conversation around anti-Semitism sort of focuses on sort of these negative pieces, but I just want to start by saying like so much of Judaism is about the incredible joy and of all of these ways of being in Jewishness. So that feels like an important framework. A question that I think trips up a lot of folks who have not spent substantial time in and with the Jewish community is what are we? I think often, especially in the West, we fall into the sort of religion paradigm of thinking about Judaism as a faith tradition, right? And that's certainly one dimension of it, right? But there are plenty of Jews of no particular religion, right? That's the fastest growing share of Jews who have no denominational affiliation in particular, right? There's all of these things. There's also the national aspect, people, right? There's tons of elements here. And I'll just say that it's important when we hear these sort of grand sweeping statements about who the Jews are or how we think, or someone trying to speak on behalf of the Jews, all of those things, that the vast majority of us exist in some overlapping Venn diagram of all or some of these buckets, right? Lots of Jewish people share some, but not all of these features, right? And so these are far from universally agreed upon definitions, and it makes it very, very complicated to say anything broad about all Jews, positive or negative in any complicated way. Okay, so if we're such like a beautiful, diverse tapestry and everything is wonderful and Jewish joy is so great, and there's no core essential feature that you could say about us in that way, why are people so mad at us? Why don't people like us? Right? Where did anti-Semitism come from? And what is it? Okay. I want to say a little bit about what anti-Semitism is, and then we're going to talk about where it came from. So the first is just like what does anti-Semitism do? I think is a really useful structure for thinking about some of these things, right? Anti-Semitism can be, right, hostility, prejudice, hatred, or violence against Jews as Jews. Anti-Semitism can draw on a pool of stories, tropes, right, narratives about Jews that get pulled to the surface in different times, in different places, by different people, for different reasons with different impacts. But there's sort of a pool of assumption about, oh, this is what Jews are or are like, right? And also anti-Semitism can operate like other forms of oppression in that it can be interpersonal, it can be institutional, it can be internalized. We're going to talk about that for just one more moment, right? Just like other kinds of oppression, like racism, all sorts of things, right? Anti-Semitism has all of these dimensions that it can be intrapersonal, right? It can cause feelings of false supremacy or false deficiency, right? It can be interpersonal. Right? I think the example, right, that I give a lot, right, are these like, where are you really from type questions, right? People have a narrative about Jews or about anyone else in their head, and then when reality differs, right, if they say, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Chicago. Okay, but where are you really from? Right? What they're saying is they have a narrative, they have a story about the person they're talking to in their head, and them being from Chicago doesn't fit the story that they've made up about this other person, right? There's that disconnect there. So similarly, right, it can be anything from those kinds of thoughtless comments all the way up in that spectrum to acts of real violence. And then the last piece of this, right, is institutional. Whether it's things like redlining, admissions quota, right, only a certain percentage of a class could be Jewish or something like that, right, police brutality, all of these things, right, just like these affect all sort of groups that are minoritized or discriminated against, these can impact Jewish people as well. This is, I think, one of the more complicated pieces of this, and this is why I feel like it's so important to address early, which is some of the potential dimensions of anti-Semitism, right? I think if we fit cleanly into one of these buckets, it would be much easier to have this conversation, and we probably wouldn't need to have a whole, webinar about what is anti-Semitism. It would just be like a bullet point. But because it's not so clear, we need to spend more time doing theory and talking about it. So I want to talk about three potential dimensions of anti-Semitism. One piece is religious anti-Semitism, right? This is in some ways the earliest version of anti-Semitism, as we'll talk about, which is hatred of Jews or discrimination against Jews as a religious community, right? Lots of Jews are religious Jews. Their religious identity is their Judaism, right? And therefore the discrimination is, oh, there's something wrong with Judaism as a faith tradition, right? Whether it's, oh, Jews are going to hell, or it's, some specific feature of Judaism as like a spiritual tradition that's problematic for the person with that view. The second dimension of this that feels important, right, is an ethnic or racial dimension, right, where Jews are grouped as a racial category, right? It's not just that there is a group of people who believe in certain things, right? It's something else. Like, for example, the first example here talks about after the Reconquista, when many Jews were first forced to convert or be exiled from Spain in 1492, right, lots of Jews who converted to Catholicism and had the same religious practices as their neighbors, at least outwardly, were discriminated against on an ethnic basis from there, right? Because having been Jewish left sort of some kind of a discriminatory marker, right? So there's this whole piece about Jews as a racial or ethnic category. And then the last one I want to talk about is political, right? Where there's a vision of Jews as having a shared political community. It's not about Jews are all a shared racial group. It's not about Jews have a religious commitment to something. It's that, oh, all Jews have X political view or are trying to do some kind of economic or political or national project, right? Like, Jews control the world or, whatever similar nonsense to that. Or that, right, Jews as a group are exploiting economically the world. Right? These are all potential dimensions of anti-Semitism. And every specific act of anti-Semitism might not fall into all three of these categories. It might have some of those features. It might have only one. It might have two, right? It's sort of a complicated blurring. It's important to say also that like hatred, like all hatreds, right? Anti-Semitism actually does a specific work. It's not just that anti-Semitism is a bad thing because it's wrong that people hate Jews or have discriminatory, views towards us. That is wrong and bad in general, but it actually does like an actual political project. So it feels important for me to sort of spell that out. This is from the same piece that the past didn't go anywhere. Anti-Semitism's job is to make ruling classes invisible. It protects ruling class power structures, diverting anger and injustice towards Jews instead. But it doesn't have to be planned out at the top. It serves the same ends, whether enshrined in law or institutionalized only in our minds, whether it's state policy, popular common sense, or acts of grassroots movements. There's a term that's like a little tricky, but I think is very useful for understanding this work, called interstitiality. There's this idea that April Rosenblum is emphasizing here, that what anti-Semitism sort of does as a political project is it positions Jews between those with more power and those with less power as sort of the face or the target of that, right? Thus using us as a kind of a shield. A really powerful current example of this dynamic is all of the sort of politics around fighting anti-Semitism that's going on in this moment, where fighting anti-Semitism is used as an excuse for crackdowns on higher education and on free speech and things like that. I'll just say explicitly, I think many of us are aware of the case of Mahmoud Khalil, right, a student activist at Columbia who was detained by ICE and is unfortunately still being held in Louisiana, with the Trump administration attempting to revoke his student visa and deport him as punishment for his activism in opposition to the war in Gaza. Right here, sort of the like nebulous claims of anti-Semitism are being used as a pretext to normalize retribution by the state for politically disfavored speech. Right, and in fact, this positions Jews as the reason for revoking people's First Amendment rights to speech, rather than the government's own desire to scapegoat immigrants or blame them for their basest struggles. Right, it instead becomes, oh, this is about Jews. This is not about sort of a fight about what should be sayable in public. This really redirects the anger towards the Jewish people and sort of makes us pay the cost for these politically unpopular decisions. What's important to sort of like come to this conversation with, I think, is some real historical grounding, right? These narratives and tropes and ideas about who Jewish people are don't come from nowhere. As I said before, they're sort of socially conditioned and they have a history. I think to do good analysis and then therefore to make the kind of change we want, we need to understand where these things are coming from. Okay, so I'm going to start a little bit of history and then we're going to get into some of the history of some of these tropes. In some ways, our story begins a little bit with Christian history, right? Every particular oppression has some unique features and is unique in its own way. I want to talk a little bit about the specificity. I've spoken a little bit about the ways in which anti-Semitism is similar to other kinds of oppression, but I want to speak for a moment about the ways in which we have some unique features. Early on, Christian leaders portrayed the Jews as collectively responsible for the death of Jesus, like the deicide charge. And that sort of gets amped up quite a bit once the Roman Empire converts to Christianity and sort of promulgates that view and that particular viewpoint. And what's so problematic about it, beyond, I don't want to wade into the sort of theological territory here, but what's so problematic about it is there's this notion of collective Jewish guilt, that there's some kind of collective Jewish problem, right, that involves Jews being in, league with secret diabolical forces, right? All of those narratives sort of get not only created, but really, really amped up in that moment. And then because of the sort of political power of the Roman Empire, those narratives get spread and spread and spread. And then as European societies, secularized, those narratives didn't just totally disappear all of a sudden, right? The image of Jewish people as a source of evil or in league with the devil, all of those things, right? The image of special evil Jewish power, all of those stay, right? They might be secularized to some degree, but they're still around, right? And in fact, as the West has, still hugely dominant cultural power, those narratives and tropes get exported all over the world, right? This isn't to say that Jews haven't and did not face anti-Semitism anywhere else. Like, that's certainly not what I'm saying. But what I do want to say that's important is that this is like this unique Jewish evil sort of feature is particular to this experience. Like, for example, when Jews experience discrimination in the Muslim world, that was in a similar way to in which other religious minorities faced that kind of oppression, right? Whereas in the Christian world, there was a particular feature of Jew hate that was going on that was different from other religious minorities facing similar kinds of oppression. I want to talk about something a little complicated here, which is defining anti-Semitism. I'm going to put like a pin in this because we're going to come back specifically to some of the complexity around defining anti-Semitism later on. I want to hold this definition loosely, right? At its core, anti-Semitism is hostility, prejudice, hatred, or violence against Jews as Jews. When you get to like the very specific of what this means on specific cases, there's a lot of complexity. So I'm not, leaping over that. We're going to come back to it in a little bit, but I want us to sort of hold this definition loosely as we start to go. And if you're like upset about it or have a quibble or there's something that doesn't work, like good, actually, like keep in mind as we think through some of these tropes, what about this definition doesn't totally work? And you'll see why the Jewish community has some real divides in thinking about this. So this is a working definition for the next, few slides. These are, I mean, this is not a non-exhaustive list of some of the tropes of anti-Semitism and their particular dimensions that come up the most frequently. This is certainly non-exhaustive, but I'll say that if spend time around anti-Semitic propaganda, if you open Twitter for 5 minutes, any of these things, right, these are the things that you will see the most frequently that I think have the most narrative sticking power and therefore are sort of like the most useful for us to unpack in our limited time together. Right, the first, as we sort of talked about, is sort of the evil or satanic notion, right? That Jews are somehow in league with the devil, something like that. That there's something particularly nefarious in this way. Right, related to this is the idea of the blood libel, right? In in this print on the left from the 1450s, I'm sorry, 1470s, I think. You can see the devil on the far left side over there making a deal with a Jewish person who's riding a pig. Right, this is like a horrible image, and also, right, what the image is trying to communicate is both the like inhumanness of the Jews, the relationship of Jewish people to Satan, and also, as you can see, a Christian child is being murdered at the top. Right, this is the sort of classic slander that Jewish practice involves the ritual murder of Christian children. Right, this is obviously unbelievably slanderous and horrible, and yet sort of this narrative sort of persists to this day. Right? One of the sort of most common versions of it that you hear around until this very moment is sort of the QAnon ideology that sort of has a narrative of this myth in it as well. The next is sort of greed and wealth elements of Judaism, right? I want to say a little bit about where this comes from, right? For centuries in the Middle Ages in Europe, right, Jews were barred from joining many craft guilds like carpenters, bricklayers, all of those kinds of trades, and were economically pressured by the need to work and earn money and have a livelihood into various kinds of commercial work, right? Particularly into money lending, for reasons that are fascinating but are not important to get into in this conversation. Right, usury, money lending at interest, was either illegal in lots of Christian societies or considered deeply, deeply, deeply immoral for Christians to do towards one another, and similarly for Jews to do towards one another, actually. But Jews were then pressured into loaning at interest to Christians, but sometimes that interest wouldn't be paid, right? There are all of these complexities around what's going on there. But this is sort of another example of interstitiality, right? Jews were forced into a particular economic role, tax collector, as money lender, of all of those things, and then stigmatized for that role and made to sort of face the brunt of anti-Semitic violence for it. So, right, you can see here, right, a much older image of it, and then also on the right, this is a contemporary image. I believe a colleague of mine got this picture, but it was being sold in Poland in 2018 at like a roadside stand. Right? These narratives of Jews as wealthy or as greedy sort of, originate in this kind of anti-Semitism and persist. The next one I want to speak about is sort of powerful puppet masters and causers of war. This also sort of replete in a lot of ways through, unfortunately, the protocols of the elders of Zion. Right? Even though Jews have been at the sidelines of power throughout the vast majority of our history, this suspicion that there's some kind of cabal of Jews controlling the world has been perpetuated for a long time. One of the sort of most important bedrock myths is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In 1903 in Russia, it gets published, and it purports to be a document that sort of that's the like meeting notes, the minutes of a meeting of a cabal of secret Jewish leaders who control the world and discussing what they're going to do and all of these things. So it's obviously a hoax and nonsensical, and at the same time, it is constantly being translated into new languages and being distributed all of the time, right? Which is horrific, and people still sort of believe in this mythology. So it's important to sort of identify that that's still active. And the other piece I wanted to sort of bring out is that the image of that is the sort of inhuman octopus monster controlling the world and identified with Judaism on the left, which one sees all the time, and we'll see later on in this presentation. The last one I want to speak about here is Jewish disloyalty, or the dual loyalty myth. Partially because Jews have our own language, in fact, many languages, right? Both Hebrew, but also there have been many Judeo languages throughout history, right? we pray for our return and have for thousands of years to our ancestral homeland in our daily prayers, right? There is all of this narrative of Jewish specificity as a community. And some of that sort of has bled into this notion of Jewish disloyalty to the places in which we live. Uh, Perhaps the most famous example, I don't know if it's still the most famous, but among the most famous examples of this is the Dreyfus Affair in the late 1800s. Alfred Dreyfus was a French artillery officer who was accused, tried, and then ultimately convicted of treason. The very, very short form, although it's worth reading more because it's horrible but fascinating, the short form of that story is that even though exculpatory evidence came forth, he was tried and convicted in a secret military court, ultimately accepting a pardon to avoid exile. And even though he was exonerated, 100 years later still, right, we see a French anti-Jewish publication showing Frenchmen shooting many Jews as traitors. Right. In fact, we were painted as instigators of war with England, right? This is a war that doesn't happen, but there's this idea that Jews are trying to sort of cause conflict, are trying to disrupt French society because we're not really French, we're really Jewish, which is something else, right? And we see that today as well. I want to speak for one more moment also about anti-Semitism as a term, as you've probably seen throughout, right? There's quite a bit of fighting. My strong preference among these, right, is for anti-Semitism, no hyphen. But I want to say a second just about why that is. If you'll notice, just in thinking about it for a moment, when we talk about other kinds of hatred, right, when we talk about Islamophobia, we talk about homophobia, we talk about transphobia, right, it uses a very different kind of language than anti-Semitism. I had often wondered about that, and then read some very upsetting books about eugenics, and now I feel like I know a lot more about it that's worth talking about for just a moment, right, which is just that this comes in the form, right? The term anti-Semitism is born out of the eugenics movement. There's so much to say about eugenics, and this isn't a presentation on that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But it feels important to say that there's this notion, right, that there's certain characteristics inherent to various races, that race is not a social construct, that it's something biological, and in fact, the state has some kind of role in shepherding the like biological health of the nation, right? There's so much, racism and ableism built into that. But there's also this particular feature of it that is anti-Semitic. When the inventor of the term anti-Semitism, Wilhelm Marr, starts to use this term, he's using it to sort of differentiate that there's a group, right, of people not being discriminated against because we're Jews as a religious practice, but actually there's something racially bad about us that should be purged from the like healthy blood pool of the nation, right? And therefore, if you differentiate it, it's not that this is about hating Jews, the people who worship the Jewish God and whatever have our particular relationship, but it's about us biologically. So anti-Semitism becomes the term to describe that as sort of the modern rational vision of this, right? Which is of course absurd, but at the same time becomes sort of a reframe around that. So it feels important to sort of say that, this is not a term we chose to describe our own hatred. And also when people get into sort of the semantic confusion around it, why is it so different, right? Is there such a thing as a Semite, right? All of this is around the sort of eugenicist language of imaginary racial categories. Okay, that was a lot of history, which is good and I think grounding and useful. And we're going to sort of pull back on some of those today. But how does this echo in our current moment, right? Why does, Wilhelm Marr and eugenics and all of these things, like how do they matter for our current moment? Okay. To talk about this effectively, we have to spend just a moment on intersectionality, a much maligned, I think hugely unfortunately concept because of its incredible use as an analytical category here. Because its originator, Kimberly Crenshaw, has had to do so much work in defending it. She has many very useful quotes in which she clearly articulates her core concept. So I want to share one here. He says, intersectionality is basically a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race and inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts. Right, the example that she actually, this is the example that originates in her first paper in which she discusses this, right? We all know that Black folks suffer from a particular kind of discrimination in the United States, right? We also know that women suffer from different kinds of discrimination in the United States. It is not that Black women suffer from, Blackness, oppression of people based on their Blackness and oppression of people based on their status as women, right? There's some unique thing that comes from that combination, right? It's not just the same as those two things. There's something particularly different, and it's worth understanding that particular feature. So therefore, I think it's essential to talk about the particular ways in which anti-Semitism should be thought of intersectionally. right? So poor anti-Semitism analysis can erase the experience of Jews of color, right? Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews who often have very complicated relationships to race, particularly. Right? Anti-Semitism is complicated and multifaceted, and it shows up for different Jews in different ways. Okay, so I want to talk about the ways in which some of these things have affected particularly American Jews. Right? The construction of whiteness as a category in the United States has had all of these specific effects. Right? One of those effects is that it's exacerbated divisions within the American Jewish community specifically. Right? One of those ways is that if we're just sort of like narratively thinking it through, as some Jews get absorbed into whiteness and are able to assimilate into that, right, that's, creates a sort of differentiation of power and a differentiation of relationship between Jews and one another, right? This leads to Jews of color being marginalized, right? Even though there have been Jews of color, as long as there have been Jews, right, it creates an effect of people's assumptions about what does a Jew look like, who is that Jewish person, right, and what narrative about what that person's role in society should be, right? Similarly, there's this particular pressure on Jews to assimilate, right? And therefore, right, the Jews were able to assimilate into this kind of whiteness, right, in which they either were able to keep their Judaism private or were pressured to do things like work on our Sabbath, right, on Shabbos, on Saturday, Friday night and Saturday, things like that. Jews were pressured to give up their religious convictions in those particular ways. And the Jews who were able to do that gained access to certain kinds of privileges that Jews who weren't able to didn't, right? At the same time, there are all of these ways in which white Jews were excluded from whiteness, right? There, or as I think many of us who know something about state constitutions and their differences from the national constitution of the United States, right? There are all sorts of restrictions based on religion in several state constitutions. There are quotas in higher education, right? In 1924, there were all sorts of immigration restrictions that excluded Jews. There's restrictive covenants on housing, meaning like you can't sell this house to these groups of people, Catholics, Black people, Jews, all of these groups that get restricted from buying certain kinds of homes, right? Who gets lent money, all of those features, right? Some Jews are able to navigate some of these things and some Jews are not. And so the ways in which we get excluded, even among white Jews like myself, right, get excluded from whiteness are important to understand. At the same time, some Jews do get absorbed into some of the privileges of whiteness, right? There are things that we get, right? If we're imagining America in this era, right? The ability to own property, right? The ability of white Jewish men to vote, right? The ability to attain high office, white Jews' inclusion in the GI Bill, which leads to a huge amount of economic uplift, right? That was not available to people of color, including, Jews of color. Okay. So what does this have to do with anti-Semitism, right? Why is all of that relevant? Why is all that? The first thing I want to say is that assimilation is one response to anti-Semitism, right? There is a pressure from society that this is the way to perform in our social world, right? And okay, great. If I just act less Jewish, or if I just act in this particular way, right? If I assimilate into the dominant society, right, then I'll be able to sort of avoid the oppression, right? It creates the assumption that all Jews are white, and also sort of goes to reinforce this narrative of, oh, people should be assimilating to the society, right? There should be some kind of norming that should happen for everybody. And if you can't fit into that norm, sorry, right? Which is hugely problematic, both for Jews and for, our whole society. We have to talk a little bit about white supremacy for this to be constructive. Um, the first piece is just the definition on the right? White supremacy, right, is the beliefs or ideas supporting the natural, right, or biological superiority of lighter skinned or white people over other racial groups. In contemporary usage, right, it often, describes ultranationalism, racism, fascist ideas, all of those things. And what feels so important to think about Judaism as it relates, and anti-Semitism as it relates to white supremacy, is the particular role Jews play in the white supremacist imagination, right, as a central figure. So you can see, I keep thinking this just happened, but as people who've seen this presentation before have reminded me, it was like a decade ago at this point. But the Unite the Right rally, you can see David Duke, the Holocaust denier and former KKK leader, sharing about the Charlottesville rally, right? And with this narrative of "they will not replace us" as the tagline, right? Who is the they who is doing the replacing in his anti-Semitic mind? Not only is it minorities, right, and various minoritized folks, but it's Jews orchestrating that he has a certain narrative about the role of Jews undermining the power of white people. Right? Anti-Semitism is being marshaled to make white people be on the defensive about their own strength and sort of pointing that discrimination towards Jewish folks. Eric Ward, I think, summarizes this in a really powerful way. He says that anti-Semitism fuels white nationalism, and fighting anti-Semitism cuts off that fuel for the sake of all marginalized communities under siege from the Trump regime and the social movement that helped raise it up. I want to say sort of two things about this. The point of fighting anti-Semitism on some level actually should be about Jews. Like Jewish safety is inherently valuable to me, not just as a Jewish person, but as someone who is a human being who cares about human beings. There's an element of this that fighting all kinds of discrimination is inherently self-important. And also, anti-Semitism as a political construct is doing political work in our society, and it's doing terrible political work. It's making our world less safe and less free. And what's important is knowing the role that anti-Semitism is playing politically so that we can dismantle it. Here we have a couple examples of anti-Semitic propaganda that feel quite important to me to address, that pull on these narratives and tropes that we discussed earlier. Right on the left, we have President Trump's tweet from the 2016 election. Right, I want to say what feels important to me to bring this up is not just to sort of like dunk on President Trump around this, but to just make the point of how are these narratives about Jewishness being invoked here, right? We have a Magen David, a Jewish star, with most corrupt candidate ever, with a background of money next to Hillary Clinton. And what's important there is it's drawing on this notion of there's a secret, Jewish cabal that's in power over the world, right? That's corruption, and it's money and it's wealth. Right, there's this idea of trying to sort of pull on this whole narrative nexus of history that we described. Similarly, we have the philanthropist and investor George Soros on the right, portrayed as a globe manipulating octopus monster. Right. Similarly, we have this narrative of Jewish inhumanity, right, wealth and power, control, all of that sort of being marshaled in the same way. It feels important to me to say, like, right, we this is fundamentally identical to images from the 1400s, right? The same narratives are being pulled on. So we need to be able to see them and understand them. I want to talk a little bit about Israel and anti-Semitism now. But to have like a real conversation about Israel and anti-Semitism, we need to talk about the Jewish people's relationship to the land of Israel. This is a beautifully done map that just shows in broad strokes the sort of movement of Jewish peoples over time historically, sort of like the trajectory of how we got to the various places we've gotten all over the world. Following the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jews end up, I mean, we had spread a little bit before, but really spread around the world from there on, right? The center of the Jewish world shifts mostly to Iraq and the Galilee and the land of Israel, but largely to Iraq, and ultimately ends up shifting all over the world. Right, Jews have ended up everywhere from our starting point of our ancestral homeland, all over the globe. Some of that movement is for all of the normal reasons that people move from one place to another, right? There's the pull factors of economic opportunity, of better life, all of those things. And some of those factors that caused us to move are things like expulsions, right? Whether that's state-run or anti-Semitic violence at a grassroots level directed at Jewish people that cause us to move all over the place, right? Everywhere in the world. I also have to say, like, we're giving this, the framing of this conversation is in partnership with the city of New York. So it's important for me to say, right, as we sort of trace this, it's quite a journey from the land of Israel to the city of New York, which has the largest Jewish population outside the land of Israel at this point. And I'll just say that that is how the Jewish community arrives in so many ways, is that mix of factors. Now I have to talk about what Zionism is just a little bit before we can get into some of this. I think that there's sometimes a real confusion point around this, right? Zionism has become, in a lot of ways, a litmus test, right? A binary choice of, are you pro-Israel or are you, do you disagree with the state of Israel? Right? Do you have all of those things around, there's a specific actually existing state, do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Things like that. I want to say that it has a much more complicated and, in my opinion, much more interesting and detailed history than these simple binaries. I could talk for 1,000 years about this, but instead of doing that, I'm just going to say for a few minutes, there's a huge diversity, right? These are arbitrarily chosen 8 categories. There are many different visions of Zionism here, right? Because the concept is that there should be the establishment of a Jewish state as a way to guarantee Jewish safety in the world, which we'll talk about for a little bit, after that. But each of these visions, each of these ideas, political Zionism, cultural Zionism, religious Zionism, all these things are different ideas about Jewish thriving and balancing various factors and priorities and values that come into that. None of those are so obvious and simple as this basic binary. The also feels essential for me in this moment to say that not every Jewish person is a Zionist, but far from that. The polling on it is complicated and difficult, both because Jews are a very small share of the population, right? We're less than 2.5% of Americans, so it's a very small percentage of people, and also lots of the polling asks questions about emotional attachment to Israel, for example. That's the longest running poll around this. So that's complicated. That's not a one-to-one with Zionism. So I want to sort of first give that caveat that not only are not all Jews Zionists, but what that means is quite complicated. That said, I think it's pretty clear at this point that there's a sizable minority of American Jews who are decidedly not Zionist. So I also want to sort of map that out, even as within the Zionist community, there's a large diversity of how to think about that specifically. That said, for a lot of Jews, Zionism equals Judaism for them in their experience. Particularly the Jewish community in the 18th and 19th century, right, was faced with particular challenges of how to answer a question of Jewish safety. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. At the same time, and in fact preceding it, there was a general rise of nationalisms, of the notion that people's rights were guaranteed by a state that was the guarantor of those rights for that group of people. I'll say I particularly this, my family, many members of my family were murdered in the Holocaust, and there's a particular notion that whatever the political ideology of Jewish people is, it should lead to the safety and thriving of Jewish people. And Zionism became, for lots of people, following the establishment of the State of Israel, that guarantor of that safety. So it makes it feel often to lots of people like attacks on Israel as a state are attacks on Jewish safety, right? And I want to take that really seriously and not be dismissive of that feeling. I want to say for just a moment, why is talking about Israel so incredibly complicated in this conversation? Here are just four of the many reasons. Right? One is that Israel identifies as the Jewish state in the world, right, and purports to represent Judaism on the world stage in numerous ways. Israeli leaders, particularly the current prime minister, but also frequently former chief rabbis, articulate themselves as speaking on behalf of Judaism or world Jewry in lots of ways. Around half, this is also hard to count, around half of world Jews live in the land of Israel, a little bit less, but approximately that. And the last piece is sort of the historical trauma that I mentioned before, is the ways in which Israel feels like Jewish safety to so many people because of our historical trauma and our incredible lack of safety. I also want to not blow past the diversity of Jewish safety around these things. It's not just Ashkenazi, right? You're Northern European Jewry that suffered from anti-Semitic violence in the Holocaust, right? You could tell the story of all sorts of Jewish communities around the world that have had really difficult experiences, right? Whether you're talking about experience of Jews in Iraq who suffered from the Farhud and things like that, there's real suffering there around the world. And so we have real sensitivity around this that comes from an experience. This gets us to some of the complexity around competing definitions of anti-Semitism. Don't worry, there's a lot of words, there's a lot of terms, there's a lot of acronyms all at once. We're not gonna pull apart each and every one of them here in this moment. But here's what I want to sort of ask in like a clear way, right? What is the goal of defining anti-Semitism, right? What does that do? What are we trying to accomplish here? Right? If something is defined as anti-Semitic, what work does that do for our communities? So each of these different definitions here, all of them conveyed by scholars, are trying to articulate something about what anti-Semitism is fundamentally, so that they can draw those clearer lines, so that it can be said this thing is anti-Semitic, and therefore sort of push that from the discourse, which often is totally healthy, right? There's a version of this, right? I would love George Soros octopus propaganda pushed out of the discourse completely. It's an anti-Semitic caricature, and it's wrong and shouldn't be in the public sphere. At the same time, this is about contesting what's legitimate to say in public and what's okay. So I think we should always enter those conversations with a lot of humility. The only moment I want to say about this that feels really important is that there are attempts to legally codify this definition, right? Particularly the IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which often paints criticism of Israel as either inherently anti-Semitic or extremely frequently anti-Semitic, which is hard. That limits people's ability to push back on legitimate criticisms, on human rights abuses, things like that, right? So other scholars have identified other definitions. Personally, I appreciate the nexus definition most of all, but there are many definitions around here that are competing. And I want to just say that what I want to leave everyone with is that this is a deeply contested thing within our own community, right? And that each group here is motivated by, I would say, really good intent to make the world a less anti-Semitic place, and everyone can enter with really good intent and come out as a result with real complexity there, right? Without an obvious answer. So I want to empower you all to feel like there is not an obvious answer in lots of cases. I want to do one quick case study here that feels important to me. I chose an example. I'm Canadian, and I chose an example close to home from Toronto, closer to home for me, both because I think it's illustrative and also because it's I think there's a little bit of psychological distance, which makes it a little more useful to think through. On June 9th, the Canadian National Holocaust Memorial in Ottawa, which you can see here, was defaced with the words "feed me" in red paint, presumably to evoke the widespread hunger in Gaza as a result of the Israeli government's policies. I had some very tough conversations about this with folks, right? Because, and I'm going to do something that I think is useful in this case, but not in every case, which is to be unbelievably, overwhelmingly, naively, foolishly charitable to the person who did the defacing here, right? And say that, like, imagining this person as someone who's just totally outraged by starvation, right? Which, especially starvation of children, which any person of good conscience should be heartbroken at human starvation, and especially starvation of children, right? There is nothing anti-Semitic about being upset about what is happening, about being upset about what the Israeli government's policies are around food aid. That is totally unproblematic. What's problematic is the way in which that feeling is channeled then into this specific act, right? The specific act is clearly anti-Semitic, right? Both because the target of it is a national symbol of Jewishness, right? As a friend in Ottawa pointed out to me, the Israeli consulate is, I think, 3 or 4 blocks away from here. That would have been a non-anti-Semitic target for this. Not that I'm encouraging people to deface buildings, but that would have been a non-anti-Semitic target for that action, right? Because then it would be targeting a representative of the state on the basis of that behavior, right? In that way, in a nonviolent way, right? And also, it's weaponizing the Holocaust in this particular way. It sort of invokes the Holocaust as a kind of morality play that Jews are supposed to have, like, learned a lesson from or something, right? Which also strikes me as deeply anti-Semitic. So I wanted to call that out because I wanted to say that, like, this person could have, as a person of good faith, taken that exact same feeling and channeled it into something non-anti-Semitic. And I hope that the education that we have here could help push in that direction. Okay, this feels, I hope you all feel the feeling I'm feeling for one second of this is the tricky stuff. And I hope that we can have, like, a nuanced and deep conversation around this. And I'll say that I would be disappointed if everyone on this call agreed with me about everything that I say here, because it would mean, we're not really all bringing our perspectives to it. When is something criticism of Israel and when is something anti-Semitic? This is such a fraught question because it touches on the most basic freedoms of our society, right? Freedom of speech, and one of the most basic freedoms that I feel, which is my freedom to be a Jewish person in our society, right? These things are really, really complicated. I'm at the same time very afraid of the weaponization of anti-Semitism as a discourse to limit free speech, right? There are huge values at play here, and I don't think there are incredibly clear and obvious answers. So I want to sort of frame all of this conversation with saying, this is quite complicated. That said, there are a few bright lines that I think are useful in guiding a constructive conversation around it. First, what things are not anti-Semitic? This is a non-exhaustive list of things that are clearly not anti-Semitic with regard to Israel and Palestine. Support for Palestinians, Palestinian people, all of those things. There's nothing anti-Semitic about that whatsoever. Criticizing the occupation, any particular action by the Israeli military, the Israeli government, policies. There's nothing anti-Semitic about criticizing a government's policies, right? Supporting any kind of arrangement, political or otherwise, that would lead to, full equality for all Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, whether that's in 2 states, 1 state, a democratic state, a binational state, a federal state. People have all sorts of interesting, complicated things here. Support for any of the things that leads to total legal equality for those people is not anti-Semitic, right? Evidence-based criticism of Israel's human rights record is not anti-Semitic. Calls for nonviolent forms of protest against Israel, right? Whether that's speech acts or boycott, divestment, sanctions, all of those things. While I may not agree with those tactics, there's nothing anti-Semitic about saying this should be nonviolently protested. This specific policy should be nonviolently protested in that way. And lastly, right, criticism or opposition to all nationalisms or nation states. Right, this also feels important if a person has a principled stand against all nationalism, a principled stand against Jewish nationalism as a subset of that is not inherently anti-Semitic. As we're saying this, though, it's important to talk about some of the most common forms of anti-Semitism around this that are important. This is also a non-exhaustive list, but is an important one. The use of classic anti-Semitic tropes that we just talked about, right? For example, blood libel, greed, the goal for world domination, all of those things are clearly anti-Semitic. Denying Jewish history in the land of Israel, saying, for example, that either Jews aren't really from Israel, right? There's all sorts of mythology around this, that Jews have no history or no historical connection to the land of Israel, right? Those things are anti-Semitic. Portraying Israel as the ultimate evil or grossly exaggerating its actual influence, right? This is like, for example, the notion of Zionists controlling the American government and things like that, right? This comes back to the idea of the world dominating cabal. Similarly, comparing Israel to Nazi Germany or calling for the expulsion of all Jews from the land of Israel/Palestine, right? All of that stuff is fundamentally anti-Semitic. And similarly, denying the humanity of Israeli Jews and justifying violence towards them or calling for violence against Jewish people in the land of Israel, right? The specific targeting of civilians, of all of those folks, or denying their humanity. Anti-Semitism as it manifests everywhere, these are a few more lines, right? Calling for or justifying violence against Jews in the way that calling for or justifying violence against any civilians is wrong, is anti-Semitic in a specific way, right? Holding Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct. This one comes up all the time, unfortunately. But the idea that all Jews everywhere have some kind of specific responsibility for state behavior of Israel, right? Or demanding, this is sort of a deeply linked one, that Jews disavow connection to Israel or publicly state their anti-Zionism or something to be allowed into community, right? All of those things. Also saying that today's Jews are not real Jews. This is linked to the sort of notion of Jews not having a history in the land of Israel, right? There's all sorts of ideas out there that there's some other group, right? Whether it's, all sorts of folks are the real Jews and that Jews today are something else, right? That's also anti-Semitic and problematic. And the last one is using Zionist to mean Jew, right? These are some of the most common sort of pitfalls that one falls into anti-Semitically and one sees. Here we get to some of the most complicated pieces. I don't mean complicated in terms of like each one of these is equally complicated to think through. I mean, these are the cases where one just requires additional data in order to understand, is this thing that's being said or done anti-Semitic or not? So I want to give some guidelines for thinking about any of these things, right? None of these things any of these things could be used in an anti-Semitic or non-anti-Semitic way. So what I want to sort of say is, just in terms of the way we think about these things, defining terms is huge. Being able to articulate clearly what it is, that you're saying to somebody else to make sure they actually understand what it is. Understanding what somebody else is saying to you is really important, right? Who is the person doing the speaking? Do they have a pattern of anti-Semitic behavior, or is it, someone who does not? Right? Is that speech accompanied by an action? So, for example, for someone to say, I don't know, as an example, for someone to call me a Zionist, right? That's not problematic. If they were to call me a Zionist and spit at me, right? Or if they were to say Israel needs to stop committing genocide, right? I work for a Zionist organization, right? And okay, there could be a conversation to have there. If they do that while spitting, though, right, that treads into anti-Semitism, right? Would they use this exact same language about a different conflict, right? That's also an important piece of data. And the last piece I want to sort of mention here is that context matters, right? Did we come here to talk about Israel? Am I coming to the local board game club and then someone sees that I wear a kippah and tzitzit, and therefore they want to start a conversation with Israel about Israel with me, right? That is much more likely to be anti-Semitic. They're causing me as a Jew to have to answer for the behavior of a country halfway around the world. At the same time, right, if we got together to talk about Israel-Palestine, it's much less problematic to bring up all of these things. That's what we're there to talk about. Okay, I know that's a lot. I know that that's heavy. This is hard work and this is hard stuff. And I'm hoping that I think the best thing we can really do is come into these things with good faith and try to understand one another. I want to give a couple recommendations and then get into some questions and answers. Some of the recommendations I just want to give for responding is, first, building trusting relationships. It's much easier to have a conversation about these things when it's someone you have enough trust in your relationship to give them feedback to be able to say, I don't think you intended this, but if your impact was that, right? To be able to say that sort of relies on us having good enough relationships with people that we can really have a conversation there. A second one, this is very easy to write in a bullet point, but extremely hard to do as a human being, which is exercising emotional intelligence, right? Being able to like look at the world and seeing how is this person's impact being felt? How right? I know we all struggle with this in some ways. How am I being felt in the world? Just understanding what's being done in that way. A third piece is education, right? Which is one of the reasons I'm grateful we're all talking about this here together, right? Having the conversation about anti-Semitism, right? Understanding the history, the tropes, all those things. Often people make these mistakes without intending them. The next one is right-sizing your response, right? Neither minimizing nor overstating. So I think this is somewhat self-explanatory, but one's colleague saying something in a work context is different than one's boss saying something, is different than one's friend, is different than the government, right? And the correct response to that and the correct level of alarm and the correct thing to do about that is different depending on both what was said and what that relationship is. And the last one I want to bring up here is considering what legal resources exist for you. This is going to be different depending on what the context was and who you are and all of those things. Right, and that might be Title VI, that might be the New York Commission on Human Rights, if you're a New York resident, all of those things. Okay. I'm going to move past that given our time. I want to get to at least one or two questions. So I'm going to look at some questions quickly, and then we're going to start to come to the end. Let me see if this is going to allow me to pull up my questions. Sorry, one moment. Great. If you would like to send me any questions, now is a good moment to do so. I'm going to do my best to synthesize as much as I can. I'm going to read questions from the chat and not ask folks to unmute. So if you want to message me, you can do so. I'm going to answer questions for just a minute. Give me 1 second to read some of these. Oh, these are great questions. Okay, great. Great. Thank you. Okay, the first question that I saw, which I thought was really useful, was specifically about, right, here yes, I'm gonna read this aloud. Right, somebody wrote to me, right, without a doubt, there's anti-Semitism on the right and the left and everywhere in between, right, and context matters. Can you share more about power dynamics and privilege at play, right, in our current political environment in the US when it comes to addressing anti-Semitism, right, which I think is an extremely useful question here. What I want to say, first of all, is just when we think about anti-Semitism and what kinds of threat exist, right? I'll say, right, the violent murder, right? If we just look at sort of acts of anti-Semitic terrorism and violent terrorism in general, right, it's overwhelmingly from the far right, right? So the kinds of danger posed by different groups is different, and at the same time, it seems pretty clear to me that the state isn't so interested, federally at least, in right-wing anti-Semitism, is much more invested in left-wing anti-Semitism. So I want to say that it's important for us, I think, as people who care about anti-Semitism intensely, to be broad-minded and being able to see it in all these places, whether it's directed by the state or not, right? What kinds of things we're bringing here. Okay, I want to just look for one more moment at a few more questions. Someone raised the question of BDS. I think this is the last question because of our constraints on time, and I'm sorry. If you want to continue the conversation with me specifically, I would love to continue. My emails, below. We'll get there in just 1 second. Someone asked specifically, isn't BDS anti-Semitic? Right? That there's a view that that the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is inherently anti-Semitic in some way. I just want to say here the reason I feel it's pretty clearly not anti-Semitic from my perspective is that I strongly believe in people's rights to assert nonviolent disagreement with any state policy. I think that that's like a bedrock of a free discourse. And while I might disagree with the tactic, or I might not think that Israel should be boycotted or sanctioned or any of those things, right? As long as someone is saying, I don't support X, and therefore I'm not going to spend money on Y, or I don't think our government should be subsidizing, the government of Israel in this particular way, I think that that's totally fine, right? As we discussed, if they're not invoking any of these anti-Semitic tropes, if they're not calling for violence against people, to me that feels like a relatively clear place to say, great, people should be able to advocate for the political position they want without violence and without invocation of those tropes, right? And as long as that person's view is a principled response to those things, that seems totally fine to me. There are so many good questions, and I wish I could address all of them. And I just want to apologize again for not being able to talk for hours and hours and hours, but we're already a minute over, and I want to be really respectful of everybody's time. I want to conclude just by saying very quick 3 bullet points. Right? The first is that anti-Semitism does political work. It maintains structures of power. The second is that our best response to that is coalition building and education, right? Not turning inward, not closing up to state power, but actually doing the work of changing our society in this particular way. And the last piece is that anti-Semitism is a human social construct. right? Which means we can construct different societies that are non-anti-Semitic. We can build something better, right? If we built this, right, as Rabbi Nachman of Breslov says, right, if you believe in breaking, you believe in fixing. So we believe that this can be fixed in a real way over time. If I want to bring us to the very end of this, which is feedback. I'm going to ask Bella if you don't mind to put the feedback form in the chat, which maybe you already did. I have the chat closed. But thank you for doing so. I would really love, and everyone at Trua would love to hear your feedback on this program. Please take 60 seconds to fill out the survey. It'll help us know what went well, what could be improved, all of those things. For the name of the event, this is Understanding Anti-Semitism, a Training for All. I'm going to leave that up for just a moment, but please, please, please do that either now or on your own time. I'd really hugely appreciate it. The last thing I want to say as we're coming to a close, oops, the last thing I want to say as we're coming to a close is thanking everyone. First, I want to thank all of my amazing colleagues who helped make this happen, right? Especially Bella, who's working on this call, also Karen and Sarah and my colleague Rabbi Jenna Shaw, all sorts of folks who helped with this. I want to thank the New York City Office for the Prevention of Hate Crimes, New York City Commission on Human Rights for funding this work. We hugely appreciate it. I want to thank all of you for coming and bringing great questions, especially the ones I could answer, also the ones I couldn't answer in this moment. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank the artists who played the song at the beginning and at the end. I'm grateful for the music. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I also want to flag two more upcoming events that Trua is doing. The first is our Executive Director, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, is leading a talk on why is anti-Semitism at the center of attacks on democracy. That's going to be online on June 23rd. We'll send out a link in the follow-up to this and the follow-up email. And we're going to have an LA briefing from rabbis and movement leaders coming up on the 24th. Time to be announced, but we'll send out some information about that as well. Thank you all again. Oh, and of course, as promised, here's my email. I'm jweiner@trua.org. Feel free to reach out. I would love to talk to any and all of you.